All right, so here is where I knew it was in my notes. This term, open head versus closed head injuries, and uh, that's what I was trying to get at that whole time. I was right. Anyway, IDEA includes traumatic brain injury as a separate category, and they say that it's defined as an acquired injury, so meaning they're not born with it, to the brain caused by an external force resulting in a total or partial functional disability, or psychosocial impairment, or both, that adversely affect a child's educational performance. Again, IDEA is that federal mandate that provides special ed dollars. And so, like in a hospital, we're not saying that in order to qualify as a traumatic brain injury, it has to impact your educational performance. But in the schools, to receive services through the schools, it must impact their educational performance. So there are physical impairments where they might lose speech, vision, hearing, other senses. They might have consistent headaches, difficulty with coordination, paralysis. They could have cognitive impairments, memory difficulties, slowness in thinking, problems concentrating, problems with perception and attention, and problems with planning and sequencing. And then the one that is common, especially if it occurs in the frontal lobe of your brain, are behavior and personality problems and changes. So severe fatigue, sudden mood swings, a total just change in their personality, anxiety, depression, and difficulty with emotional control. So what are the outcomes? Remember, it's not necessarily that depending on how severe the brain injury is, what their outcome will be. That has something to do with it. But really, the most important factor that's going to account for their functioning after traumatic brain injury is their abilities before. So think about it this way. If a child is 10, and so they're kind of past that birth to 5 stage that's really critical in language and cognitive development, and they get a brain injury that affects language, then most likely, because they already have a lot of foundational skills, they're going to recover better. They're going to have they're going to get closer to where they started. You take a child that's 3, right in the middle of a critical language learning period, and they have a brain injury, they might not recover, and they might not be able to gain the same, and so end up in the same place as the 10-year-old that has the exact same head injury. So we just have to think about their abilities prior to their injuries. And the reality is that we don't typically see them fully recover. And the range is from mild to severe, their outcomes. And if you can understand, even just from this very foundational look at traumatic brain injury and language, you can understand how many factors go into what the outcomes are. So it's going to impact school performance. It can impact their transition and life outcomes, just their independence, their functional independence, their cognitive performance, their reading ability, their social skills, and their behavioral skills. What does their language look like specifically? Sometimes they actually have a type of aphasia, which is commonly associated with a stroke. So if you've ever been around someone who's had a stroke and they have a hard time speaking, it's kind of like that. It's called aphasia. And so if they had this language prior to the traumatic brain event and they lose it, and there's different types of aphasia. If you recall, looking at the brain, there's this Wernicke's area and Broca's area, and they kind of account for different functions. Kind of depends if it's going to affect your ability, your receptive abilities, or your expressive language abilities. There's a whole range of severity. But overall, we know it's going to impact their syntax and their social skills. And it's most likely, no matter if it's receptive or expressive, it's going to affect them socially. So it affects their pragmatic skills. And so again, depending on the skills they already have. So in a stroke patient that's 70, They probably already have some significant connections with others. They have a lifetime of a certain level of pragmatic skills, and so when they lose that, the people around them kind of compensate. If there's a 6-year-old that has a brain injury and kind of lacks pragmatic skills, people are less likely to compensate for that and understand that. So some people, many children do show improvements. And again, remembering that that severity of the injury is not necessarily predictive. It's definitely not independently predictive of their recovery. Intervention. This first one kind of seems like a cop-out. The best prevention is, or the best intervention is prevention. But what we know about traumatic brain injury, you can't undo it. And so just really stressing the importance of the fact that this is preventable and encouraging kids to use seatbelts and bicycle helmets and appropriate sports equipment. And I think it's just like a general knowledge of trying to assist kids and not assume that they have someone in their life that is educating them about that. And so just making sure you are telling them, hey, make sure you wear your helmet when you're riding home from school, and trying to keep it from happening. The reality is that the prevalence of traumatic brain injury, it most commonly occurs in boys. What do you know? I think between 18 and 23 or 25. And it's almost always the ones I've seen in the hospital are some kind of accident, ATV, car, motorcycle. And it seems stereotypical almost, but the reality is it's just that age group, boys tend, in their maturity level, tend to feel invincible. And so I have seen some really sad things happen to that age group. And so just making sure you're letting them know this is a real thing and helping them prevent it. The other really big area here, other than just addressing those needs that you would see as a result that change their academics or their language, is their return to school. Traumatic brain injury is a very unique category of disability because there aren't really other categories of disability where you had something completely and then lost it completely, maybe within like the same school year. So yeah, there's progressive disabilities and degenerative disabilities. But I'm saying here is this kid who up to 13 years old has been in the regular ed classroom and had no struggles. And then they get this brain injury and all of a sudden they're looking at special education and they're possibly looking at a behavior change. Not only how hard that must be on a child, because that's so new, but that family. So, a lot of times when we're working with children with disabilities, unless we're working in younger grades where we're doing a lot of eligibility, we're working with kids that have been diagnosed and probably seen for a long time. But when you're dealing with a child with traumatic brain injury, it's just different. There's a great likelihood that that's the first time that family and that child has ever even stepped into the world of any kind of need for adaptations or accommodations. So just that extreme sensitivity to their return to school. They're not only dealing with the change from their brain, but they're going to probably deal with peer changes and friendship changes and ability changes and like literal placement, classroom changes. That's a lot. That would be a lot for an adult. These elements of a successful education program are just along that line, control the environment as best you can, maybe in the beginning, decrease the people to teacher ratio. There's a lot of intensive and repetitive instruction. There might be behavioral programming. I think the other big ones here would just be that readjustment counseling. If there is access to that component, I think that's a very, very critical component in this population. The next couple slides are just showing some suggested classroom accommodations and test accommodations. These are used for many different areas of categorical disability, but I have listed them here. This is more just for you to keep. I hope some of this stuff can be a resource to you as you're teaching and planning intervention and, IEPs. So that's what I've listed here, the accommodations, some suggested accommodations and some suggested test accommodations versus just everyday classroom accommodations. The last part is another case study, and I just would like for you to read this, and I want you to create a list of recommendations for methods that could actually assist this boy, Scott. I again encourage you to write this down and let it be an area of brainstorming for you. So hopefully using those lists I just gave you and some ideas I just gave you, you can think of what might be appropriate for him and allow that creative energy to keep flowing and write down some ideas. And even after doing it for 10 plus years, there were days when I'd be sitting down to write an IEP and I had done it 100 times, but I would still feel like the ideas weren't coming, the words weren't coming. And so I can't tell you how valuable lists that I had made of ideas came in helpful. Like whenever I was just feeling stuck and I just went back and looked at these lists I had previously made, it's like, oh yeah, that would be good here too. And sometimes it's just the wording. So I highly encourage you to take advantage of opportunities to go ahead and write those things down and keep them with you. As always, please don't hesitate to email me or call me. Set up a time to meet with me if you have questions about this lecture or really anything else pertaining to the class. And then make sure you complete this chapter quiz, and you can go ahead to the next chapter. The next lecture is actually going to cover chapter 13 and 14. So if I were you, I would go ahead and read both of those, and I will see you there.